Modernity doesn't execute its victims with a strike. It erodes your frequency through a slow, systematic leak. You don't even realize you're drowning in the Melbourne Grey until the water is above your soul's baseline, 5:30 a.m. That alarm isn't a summons to greatness. It's the trigger for your default survival mechanism. You're not waking up to manifest. You're waking up to endure the cognitive cage you've built. Before your feet even touch the floor, you've surrendered your cognitive sovereignty to the glass rectangle. You're injecting low vibrational data directly into your prefrontal cortex before you've even taken a breath. The algorithm weaponizes the success of others against your internal peace. In this urban landscape, the tall poppy fear keeps you small, while the digital feed screams that you're lagging behind the elite. It's a paradox of paralysis. Somewhere inside that static, your inner fire enters a state of bio-rhythmic decay. You stare at the ceiling and feel the void. You've stopped being the architect of your evolution and become a ghost in your own narrative. That is the chilling reality of modern exhaustion. As a mentor, I witness this systemic erosion of the spirit daily. We are observing a mass-scale abdication of the self. It is not merely burnout. It is not the transient spike of anxiety that we have been taught to pathologize. Those are just the tremors before the collapse. It is something far more insidious. It is the metabolic white flag, the total surrender of your cognitive sovereignty to the relentless noise of the void. You see it reflected in the glass of the pre-dawn train from Southern Cross. Young men, ghosts of their potential, staring blankly through rain-streaked windows, already defeated before the workday even begins. Women sitting in dim, unheated apartments, eating dinner alone, their identities slowly dissolving in the parasitic glow of a laptop screen. They are present in body, but their agency is being harvested by the algorithm. The great irony of the modern battler, consuming endless cascades of digital motivation while feeling their actual capacity hemorrhage week after week. It's a dopamine loop of false progress that leaves you cognitively bankrupt. You aren't lazy. Let's dismantle that toxic myth right now. Laziness is a choice. What you're experiencing is identity, debt. You have over-leveraged your spirit and now the interest is due. The subtle disgust you feel in the mirror isn't about your appearance. It's the visceral realization that you no longer view yourself as a person worth the agony of becoming. You've internalized a glass ceiling. And most people never notice the exact moment the pilot light goes out. It happens in the sterile silence of a South Bank high-rise or the gray transit between Flinders Street and the suburbs. The precise moment they unconsciously decide that the version of them who could have changed the world is officially dead. This is the terminal velocity of the unawakened soul. You whisper it to the mirror in the pre-dawn gloom. This is probably all I will ever be. Consider the parable of the rough sleeper anchored within the gray ribs of Southern Cross Station, a ghost in the machinery of the morning rush. Every morning, a loop of architectural indifference. Cold Melbourne concrete. The frantic, rhythmic percussion of R.M. Williams' boots and corporate heels passing him by. A palm outstretched for copper, met only by commuter blindness, that specific urban reflex, where we refuse to acknowledge another's humanity to protect our own comfort. No temporal horizon, no emergent self, just the neural resignation of base-level survival. He had surrendered to the concrete, just as you have surrendered to your exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, the algorithm of his despair was interrupted. A disruptor stepped onto the platform at Flinders Street, cutting through the gray Melbourne drizzle with surgical precision. Bespoke tailoring, absolute neural sovereignty. He possessed that rare, grounded frequency that makes the chronically exhausted instinctively avert their eyes, as if looking directly at him would expose their own identity debt. The man approached him, arm outstretched, functioning on the base-level survival instinct. He wasn't looking for a connection. He was looking for the standard currency of the transactional void: pity. The executive stopped. He didn't reach for a wallet. He didn't perform the polite Australian avoidance. He looked the man directly in the eyes, initiating a profound, disruptive intervention that froze the station in time. Do you only take from people? Have you ever given anything? It wasn't a question of money. It was a challenge to his very soul, level output. The air outside Southern Cross Station turned to ice. That wasn't just a question. It was a kinetic disruption of his entire cognitive framework. The mentor had bypassed the social script of spare change and aimed straight for his ontological core. For years, his existence was defined by the Beggars Loop, a repetitive sequence of micro-rejections and cold shoulders under the Melbourne drizzle. The concept of contribution was foreign, a relic of a life he had effectively lobotomized to endure the shame of the street. He looked into the psychological mirror and saw a void, a hollow vessel waiting for the scraps of accidental charity. He had completely outsourced his self-worth to the passing whims of the CBD crowd, realizing he was surviving purely on the mercy of a system he no longer belonged to. Pay close attention. This is the lethal trap of identity architecture. When you stop proactively designing your presence, the environment begins to architect your obsolescence. You aren't just exhausted. You are being structurally dismantled by your own passivity. Once the mind accepts a submissive role, the body begins living inside that cage permanently. You stop moving through the world and start letting the world move through you. You're not just tired, mate. You're being overwritten by a script of your own surrender. You trigger the self-censorship protocol. You stop experimenting because you fear the tall poppy pruning. You stop risking embarrassment, effectively uninstalling your imagination modules to maintain a sterile, static existence. This is pathological loyalty to a ghost. You become brutally devoted to the version of yourself that is actively dismantling your potential, mistaking your identity architecture for a prison you aren't allowed to renovate. Standing there on the Southern Cross platform as the Melbourne wind sliced through his suit, the executive delivered a foundational axiom. It wasn't motivational fluff. It was a cold recalibration of reality. Value exchange. It is the physics of the social market. If you have nothing to offer, no vision, no grit, no output, why should the world grant you anything but silence? You aren't a battler if you've stopped fighting. He vanished into the morning gray of the CBD. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the brutal clarity of truth. A wake-up call for those who have spent too long in a functional coma. Radical honesty is a cognizant hang. It strips away the hollow Australian myth that the universe owes you a fair go just for showing up. It removes the sedative fantasy that life will eventually rescue you without a total overhaul of your inner architecture. That night, his biology refused the functional coma. The screams of the E-class trams and the metallic groans of the city became a mirror to the friction in his soul. When you stop lying to yourself, the silence becomes deafening. The external chaos of the CBD was a whisper compared to the neurostatic within. His brain was finally performing a forced defragging, dismantling the tall poppy fear that had kept him playing small to stay safe. As the dawn light touched the Flinders Street clocks, he sat up. He had stopped asking for a break. He was now auditing his value output. Money is just a lagging indicator of the utility you provide to the tribe. This is where the neuro-pioneer is born. Real psychological metamorphosis doesn't ignite through confidence or cheap motivation. It triggers when your entropy threshold is breached, and you finally decide to contribute more than you consume. Your neural architecture recalibrates the nanosecond you euthanize the victimhood loop. Realize this. The moment you stop asking, "Why hasn't the universe fulfilled my invoice?" is the moment you actually start living. Pivot. Audit your internal inventory. Strip away the entitlement. Ask the only question that carries market weight. What value am I actually injecting into the collective ecosystem? Reality mirrors your frequency. A few days later, walking the jagged outskirts of the tram tracks near Southern Cross, he spotted an anomaly in the gray Melbourne gravel. Biological resilience. Small, imperfect, unrecognizable to those moving too fast. These wildflowers weren't waiting for a permission slip to exist. They were simply alive. The transactional shift. The next time a commuter dropped a gold coin into his cup, he didn't just accept the charity. He issued a receipt of beauty. He handed back a flower. Something strange happened. The Melbourne frost thawed. People stopped the commute grind. They didn't just see a battler. They saw a peer. Connection isn't a luxury. It's the ultimate currency in a city that's forgotten how to look up. Why? Not because of the flower's market price. It's the value exchange. When you contribute, you hack the social algorithm. You move from a state of lack to a state of abundance, forcing the human psyche to acknowledge your dignity. Look at his hands. Dirty, but purposeful. That's the moment the internal architecture realigns. He wasn't just surviving the Melbourne economy anymore. He was influencing it. The identity shift is the only real wealth you can bank. True discipline doesn't scream. It's the quiet sound of a kettle in a freezing Carlton flat at 5 a.m. It's the stoic refusal to let the environment dictate your internal state. You wake up before the city does to reclaim your narrative. No cinematic score, no hype, just the friction of laces. This is where the fear of embarrassment the tall poppy trap dies. You aren't doing it for the applause. You're doing it because the quiet destruction ends here. One small, deliberate choice. I made a pact with the reflection in that cold Melbourne glass. I refuse to inhabit the skin of my weakest iteration. I am done being a passenger to my own biological entropy. Listen closely. The average person mistakes intensity for growth. Wrong. Real discipline is a radical identity reconstruction. It is the systematic deconstruction of your beta default state to build a high-value architecture. It is the 5 a.m. grit when the wind off the Yara cuts through your coat. It is the silence of reading on the morning commute while others seek digital validation. Stoic mastery requires no audience. It requires the private execution of your will to value. Modern culture is a dopamine trap. It manufactures passive consumption to keep the masses docile. You are being fed cheap stimulation while your execution engine atrophies in a cycle of temporary escapes. Endless stimulation is the arsonist of self-respect. Your neurochemistry begins to mistake observing someone else's life for participating in your own. To wake up, you must first realize you are being sedated. Cycles reset. Months bled into the Melbourne Grey. The executive returned to the steel ribs of Southern Cross Station, expecting to find that same anchor of despair, but the vacancy was gone. The powerless vessel had vanished from the concrete. In that void stood a Bloom, a modest stall, meticulously curated. The man behind the counter? No longer a casualty of the dopamine void. He had recoded his internal architecture. A flower seller, a merchant of beauty, a founder of his own reality. They locked eyes across the platform. No words were required, just a high-frequency recognition of the work done in the dark. He didn't find luck. He simply stopped viewing himself as a passenger. He prioritized the execution engine over the sedation of the masses. Real discipline is not a lash on your back. It is the refusal to abandon your own potential. It is the daily audit of your cognitive sovereignty. You realize that to wake up is to stop betraying your future self for a moment of cheap comfort. Build your light from the inside. Your new life begins when your reflection is no longer a stranger you've betrayed. It all begins quietly, like the first drop of rain against a window before the Melbourne dawn. Reclaim yourself.